In this video, I'm going to present an ontological argument that a friend and I developed a while back to show that the view of panentheism is more theologically plausible than theism. This argument is inspired from similar contentions made by two contemporary theologians, Philip Clayton and Ethel Schultz, who've drawn upon ideals traceable to such historical philosophers as Nicholas of Cusa and Benedictus Spinoza. Clayton and Schultz have also argued for panentheism opposed to theism in their ontological arguments, but less successfully, I think, than the one I'm going to present to you. After I have briefly presented some definitions, I will lay out my argument, which includes a reductio ad absurdum of theism, and then move on to explain and defend my premises. The core of my argument makes use of a particular concept of infinity, a kind of metaphysical or ontological infinity that only God presumably possesses as a proper superlative of his nature. After laying all this out, I conclude a monistic form of panentheism over theism. And to be explicit, my argument is not aimed to show God's existence, but rather that God's nature is radically different than theists, or than what theists affirm. So what exactly do these special terms I have just mentioned mean? Ontology, firstly, is general study or the general study of the nature of being, existence, or substances. An ontological argument seeks to demonstrate the existence or nature of God by a priori considerations on the concept of God. By panentheism, it suffices to say that this is the view that God is not ontologically distinct from the world, that the world is a mode or modal part of God. And conversely, by theism, it suffices to say that this is the view that God is ontologically distinct from the world, that God's being completely transcends the being of the world. As for the concept of infinity that I briefly mentioned, I will go into some depth as to what I mean as I lay out my argument. Right now, however, it is sufficient to say that a being is ontologically infinite if it includes all things in itself, or if the being is that besides which nothing ontologically other can exist. And conversely, the negation of being ontologically infinite is to say that a being is ontologically finite. With this, we now proceed to my argument. Premise 1. God is the greatest conceivable being. Premise 2. An ontologically infinite being is a greater conceivable being than an ontologically finite being. Premise 3. If X is distinct from Y, then X and Y are ontologically finite beings. Premise 4. Suppose that God is distinct from the world. 5. Conclusion. Therefore, God is an ontologically finite being. 6. Conclusion. Therefore, an ontologically infinite being would be greater than God. 7. Conclusion. Therefore, God is the greatest conceivable being, and there is some conceivable being such that it is greater than God, which is absurd. 8. Conclusion. Therefore, God, the greatest conceivable being, an ontologically infinite being, is not distinct from the world. Here, I'll also briefly show a fuller deduction in formal logical notation with a literal translation, so that one can see the argument's validity. You can pause the screen and check if you like, otherwise I'll be moving on to my explanation of some premises. Explication and defense of premises. Premise 1. God is the greatest conceivable being. Premise 1 is akin to St. Anselm's definition of God within his classical ontological argument, and I don't think any theist would want to deny it. After all, a greatest conceivable being is plausibly what one means by the word God. For if you could conceive of a greater being, then that would surely be God. For example, if one can conceive of X as more powerful than a being Y, then X is a greater conceivable being than Y in terms of power. And if no Y can be conceived that is as powerful as X, then it seems X is the greatest conceivable being in terms of power. That is, X is omnipotent. Premise 2. An ontologically infinite being is a greater conceivable being than an ontologically finite being. Believe it or not, it seems that premise 2 is really the only controversial statement in my argument. So I'll give a more detailed explanation and defense of it. To see that premise 2 might plausibly be true, one must first have an adequate idea of what is meant by this sort of infinity. It's one held by some philosophers and theologians, which I have called ontological infinity, where ontological relates to being or substance, And this idea of ontology tacked onto infinity must be distinguished from other types of infinity, such as quantitative ideas in mathematics. In mathematics, for instance, one might identify potential infinites and actual infinites, where a potential infinite would be my counting from some quantity, say 1, and going on potentially forever, 1, 2, 3, 4, ad infinitum. And conversely, in mathematics, there is also the idea of actual infinites, such as in set theory, where an actual infinite set of numbers or quantity applies. These mathematical concepts of quantitative infinity are something else entirely from what I mean and what philosophers and theologians mean when talking about an absolute, metaphysical, or ontological infinite. The idea of infinity we are getting at is qualitative, perhaps akin to saying God has infinite knowledge and goodness, and so forth, with all other positive qualities, including absolutely infinite or total being. This is a very different idea of infinity and can be expressed in a number of ways. Proponents of this concept, like the philosopher Benedictus Spinoza, seem to argue that if God is absolutely infinite, ontologically speaking, then there is nothing that is not an aspect or mortal part of God. Or one might say, if any being is truly separate from God, or if there is some being God doesn't include in himself, then God would have boundaries and limits in some respect, and therefore God would be finite in some respect, not infinite. Thus I mean infinite along similar lines as Spinoza, as a sort of superlative possessed by a being X, if and only if X is that besides which nothing ontologically other can exist. As Rutgers philosopher Martin Lynn explains, what's at play here is a very strong conception of infinity as absolute infinity or absolute totality. Ordinarily, people can imagine many infinite things all coexisting upon their own planes. For example, infinitely long sets of odd numbers alongside infinitely long sets of even numbers. However, Spinoza makes it clear that such common examples are not truly infinite in the fullest sense, but rather involve a partial negation. They are merely infinite in a qualified manner, infinite after their own kind. As such, the sort of infinity which applies to God can only be unqualified absolute infinity, and it is for this reason God is something which fills all existence. Or, as philosopher Gilead Bar Eli notes, when we think of something as infinite, we think of it as infinite in a kind. It can be infinitely long, or of an infinite duration, or of infinite extension or knowledge, and so on. All these are instances of what we might call infinity in a kind. God, however, is absolutely infinite, across kinds. God does not only have the fullness of each kind, but the fullness or entirety of all kinds. There is no kind or quality you can coherently think of which he lacks. And each of them he has infinitely. That is, for each of them he is infinite in a kind. This means that any quality or attribute that can be coherently ascribed to God does in fact belong to him in the fullest possible degree. So if God is absolutely or ontologically infinite, he must be coextensive with everything, and nothing can be outside him. God is the proper whole of reality, an all-embracing unity, the ultimate totality. I think there's something intuitively true contained in this concept of infinity, and that God would arguably possess such a superlative nature. Now, this concept seems entirely conceivable and coherent, and therefore it poses a problem for theists who view God differently, who view God as ontologically finite. The problem is that an ontologically infinite being does in fact seem greater than a theistic being. The theist can then either deny or concede that God is ontologically infinite. If the former, the theist might deny the concept by saying that ontological infinity doesn't really capture a truly great-making quality. But I think this is very counterintuitive to deny of God. For, not only do there seem to be no good reasons to deny this, but also presumably God lacks absolutely nothing. Moreover, to formally reject God's being ontologically infinite, one would have to show where a logical contradiction exists in this concept, which I don't think is possible. This leaves the latter for the theist. The theist would have to concede and admit that the concept of ontological infinity is something their idea of God lacks. Premise 3. If X is distinct from Y, then X and Y are ontologically finite beings. Given this explication of premise 2, premise 3 becomes quite clear. X is ontologically finite if X is that besides which something ontologically other can exist. This implies that X is distinct from whatever it is that exists besides it. In other words, a being X is finite in virtue of its ontological boundedness or limitedness by the existence of, or even possible existence of, any other being Y, thereby implying that Y is also bounded or limited in turn by X. From the concept of what it is to be ontologically infinite, if X does not include all things in itself, then X and that which exists besides X have ontological restrictions, namely each other, and would thus be finite and separate beings. Premise 4. Suppose that God is distinct from the world. As for premise 4, it is contained in the very definition of theism, that the being of God is ontologically other than the being of the world, and so premise 4 is, I think, indisputable. What's left? The rest of the steps of the argument, that is, steps 5 through 8, follow logically as conclusions from the premises I have defended. Therefore, since absolute or ontological infinity seems to fit nicely with God's being the greatest conceivable being, there cannot be anything that is not included in the being of God. In more archaic terminology, this is to say that God possesses all positive reality in every respect. For if not, God would lack reality in some respect and be less real than a greatest conceivable, maximally real being, which is absurd. In conclusion, then, if God exists, this argument entails that theism cannot be true.